Alrighty, guys, this is going to be chapter 15, and this is going to be video 1. This chapter 15 notes are really long. It's going to be divided into 3 videos. So this is going to be our first video, just introducing you to Darwin's theory of evolution. We're going to be talking a little bit about some of the history of his theory and some of the other scientists that he studied to help him develop his theory. So let's start first with just the definition of evolution. Now, we're going to talk in class a lot about some of the controversy around this theory. What does it mean to evolve? We can use the word evolution in a lot of different ways. In terms of biology, it means how a population changes over time, not an individual. Okay, so the word evolution just means to change over time. Now, let's talk about the theory of evolution. A theory, remember, is a hypothesis that we have tested and tested and tested, and it's generally accepted because we've developed or seen the same results over and over and over again. Okay, the theory of evolution works in that same way. There's a lot of evidence out there to back up the theory, and it's a hypothesis that's been created that's based on the evidence that we've already seen. If we have not done the cube activity in class yet, you guys are going to do something about this coming up. If we have done the cube activity, you guys will maybe understand a little bit more about what I'm talking about how the theory of evolution is a theory and that it's based on evidence from the past. All right, Charles Darwin, here he is as a young man, traveled on a boat called the HMS Beagle. If you don't know what HMS stands for, it stands for Her Majesty's Ship. There's a little trivia for you. He had a lot of things going on in his life. He knew that he was very passionate about nature. He explored a lot of different, career options. And at one point in time, he thought he was going to be a doctor. He was taken on this voyage on the Beagle, and he continued to study nature while he was on this trip, and he eventually ended up in the Galapagos Islands over here off the coast of South America. So they rode all the way up here, and here's the Galapagos right here. So it was quite a long journey. He saw lots of different organisms, but the Galapagos was a very special place that he visited. While he was there, he noticed several fossils that he studied on the mainland, and that they resembled species that were alive today and species that looked different, had different traits, but were alive on each of the different Galapagos Islands. So you can see down here at the bottom, his thought was, what happened to these species? How are they related to living species? If you guys don't know already, most of the species that have lived on our planet have gone extinct. They just did not evolve the traits necessary for them to survive. So he wanted to look at, why didn't all these species survive? And why do we have some things today that look like these species, but not exactly the same? One of the things that he saw was these huge giant armadillos. Think the armadillos from the movie Ice Age, kind of like those, and that they looked really similar to armadillos today. And he wondered, why are these large armadillos not still alive? So he was trying to figure out, how did they change over time? Is this new armadillo completely different? One thing he didn't have was DNA to compare the two, which would have helped him out really quickly, but he didn't have that. Okay. Now the Galapagos. Each island is its own little teeny tiny world. It has its own climate. There's one that is really rocky. There's one that's very desert, that's covered in deserts. There's one that's very mountainous. There's some that have lush sort of tropical rainforests on them. And he noticed that there were different species on every island, but they all had similarities. So they all were very close to each other, but they were different species, but had a lot of similarities. So kind of like what he was thinking with those armadillos on the previous slide. They're similar, but how did they get to be so different? Now let's talk about a few of the scientists that shaped some of his thinking. So he had all of the stuff that he gathered on all of his trips, including his visits to the Galapagos. One of the pieces of information that he used to help develop his theory was that the Earth is many millions of years old, which at the time that Darwin was studying in the 1800s, he was not that was not necessarily widely accepted. The biblical theory that the world was just a few thousand years old was more accepted than what was being shown in geologic time or in fossil time. And two scientists named Hutton and Lyell were actually publishing that theory and that idea based on some of their studies in geology and in fossils. So he used some of their information to help back up some of the evidence that he had for his theory for evolution. Okay, so Hutton was one of those scientists, and he proposed that rock layers form over millions of years. So think like the side of the Grand Canyon. You see all these layers of all this sedimentary rock, and then that rock gets shaped by geologic forces. While he was looking at these layers of rock, he could see that the layer that was on the bottom was definitely older than a few thousand years old. So that helped to support some of Darwin's ideas. Lyell's idea was that scientists must explain things that we see here in the present with what the evidence that we have from the past. Like, for example, fossils that you would see in the very bottom layers of say, something like the Grand Canyon, we have to explain those based on the evidence we have today. We can't go back in time. We can't hop in that time machine and go back and look at exactly what happened. So we have to come up with a hypothesis based on what we see right now, which was very helpful for Darwin. Lamarck. Now, Lamarck is the bad guy here. Lamarck is a loser. Remember this. Lamarck is a loser. Okay. He's really not a loser. He developed a pretty good theory for what he had at the time, but Darwin built on it. Lamarck had the idea that by using or not using something, you gained a trait or lost a trait during your lifetime, and that then you could pass this on to your offspring. So this would be like if I lost my right hand, okay, in an accident, I would lose that trait that would be passed on to my children. So then my children will be more likely to not have a right hand, which doesn't make any sense at all. That because we know DNA, we know that that doesn't change the DNA in my cells or the cells that would be passed on to my children. One of his examples that he used was giraffes, and he thought that giraffes at one point in time all had very short necks, and that over time, as they used them, okay, and he thought of this in a population, not like population like lots of different giraffes over lots of time, not one individual giraffe. He thought that as giraffes started to use their necks more, their necks would get longer, and then they would pass that down to their kids, who would then get longer necks, and then get longer necks, and then get longer necks. Okay, and he was definitely not correct. That's not what happened. It's genetically giraffes just have longer necks. For some reason, that made them more adapted. It made them more fit, which we will talk about later. And as they became more fit, as the giraffes with longer necks became more fit, they got to have more babies. So longer necks became the better trait. Okay, so he was definitely not correct. So as you guys are going through this unit, I want you to think about: am I thinking like Lamarck or am I thinking like Darwin? So whenever you guys are talking about species later on, I want you to think: am I thinking like Lamarck? Okay, we don't develop traits as we grow; we get them from our parents. Okay, we don't get to develop new traits as we go. We're not superheroes. We don't get to mutate and get any new traits. Sorry, guys. Okay, now the last scientist here that contributed to some of Darwin's theories was Thomas Malthus, and his was about human population. Darwin didn't do a ton of stuff with human population, but it was still population, groups of individuals. And he talked about that if a population grows, they're going to run out of resources and competition will begin. And Malthus specifically was focused on humans. He said, as we get bigger and bigger and our populations get bigger and bigger, eventually we're going to run out of space. We're going to have competition. We're going to start competing for food. And that helped Darwin to figure out the theory of natural selection, the whole survival of the fittest thing. Okay, so we've got those three sets of scientists. You got Hutton and Lyell, Lamarck, and Thomas Malthus that helped to form some of Darwin's theories. And we'll talk more in class about all these as well. All right, and that is it, you guys, for video 1.